In this video, you will learn how to add and subtract unlike fractions, so fractions that have different denominators. Today we're going to go over how to add unlike fractions. I want you to write down any of the steps that are underlined to keep as notes in your math folder. We're going to add 1/2 plus 1/8. Step 1 is to find the LCD, the least common denominator. So I'm going to ask, what are some common multiples of 2 and 8? What are numbers that they can both become? And I know that I can set up the slide method to help find the LCD. So what's a number that can divide 2 that can also divide 8? Well, I know 2 can be divided by 2, and that becomes 1. So I put the answer under 2. 8 divided by 2 is 4, so I put the answer under 8. Now I'm going to look at the numbers 1 and 4, and they do not share a number other than 1. So if I were to divide by 1, I would still get 1 and 4 as answers, so I can stop there. I'm going to circle an L around everything under the division sign and the bottom row and multiply anything that falls inside of the L. 2 times 1 is 2, and 2 times 4 is 8. So the LCD is 8. The least common denominator, the smallest number that 2 and 8 share, is the number 8. Step 2 is where we use fraction times fraction equals fraction to get common denominators. So I know from the previous slide that I learned the LCD is 8. So I set up a fraction times fraction where 1/2 will be multiplied by a fraction and 1/8 will also be multiplied by a fraction. The LCD goes at the very end, so 8 is going to be put at the very end of the answer. Now let's look at 1/2, and I ask myself 2 times what equals 8? That's 4. And if I do it to the bottom, I also do it to the top. So if there's a 4 on the bottom, there's a 4 on the top. 1 times 4 equals 4. The equivalent fraction of 1/2 is 4/8. It's worth the same value. Now I'm going to do the same thing to 1/8. 8 times what equals 8? That's 1. If I put 1 on the bottom, I also put 1 on the top. And 1 times 1 equals 1. So the equivalent fraction to 1/2 is 4/8. The equivalent fraction to 1/8 is 1/8. It didn't change. Now I'm going to use these fractions. Step 3 is to rewrite the problem and solve. So the equivalent fraction to 1/2 is 4/8. So wherever 1/2 was in the problem, it will be replaced with 4/8. The equivalent fraction to 1/8 is also 1/8. And it's really important that you make sure you place them in the exact order the problem placed them in, especially in a subtraction problem. Now that these fractions have the same denominator, I can add just like I normally would. So 4 plus 1 is 5, and 8 is the denominator. It will not change. The last step is, can you simplify it? So if I look at 5 and 8, is there a number that they can both be divided by other than 1? And the answer is no. So 1/2 plus 1/8 equals 5/8. Our next example is going to be 1/2 plus 1/10. Now before I start this problem, I'm going to write my steps out to the side. So I know my first step is to find the LCD. To find the LCD, I'm going to look at the denominators of both fractions. And for step 1, I'm going to set up my slide method. 2 and 10. And I know 2 and 10 are both even numbers, so I'm going to ask myself, what can I divide 2 by that I can also divide 10 by? And since they're even, 2 can divide both of those numbers. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 10 divided by 2 is 5. Since there's a 1, I know I'm done. So I'm going to make my L shape and multiply everything inside. 2 times 1 is 2, and 2 times 5 is 10. So the LCD equals 10. That was step 1. So now when I look back at my problem, I'm I'm going to look at both denominators and see if either of these fractions already has the denominator of 10. And 1/10 already has 10 as its denominator. So after step 1, when I go on to step 2, fraction times fraction equals fraction, I'm only going to set up one fraction times fraction because 1/2 is the only fraction that needs to change. And the LCD was 10, so at the end of my fraction times fraction, I'm going to put 10. 2 times what equals 10? Well, it's 5. If I put it on the bottom, I'm also going to put it on the top. 1 times 5 is 5. So step 2 was my fraction times fraction, and what I just created was an equivalent fraction for a half. So instead of 1/2, I can also look at 1/2 as being 5/10. So now when I go back to the problem, step 3 says for me to rewrite it and solve. So I'm going to look at 1/2 and I'm going to rewrite it as the new equivalent, 5/10, plus 1/10 did not need to change because it was already had the denominator of 10. So now I solve 1/10 and 5/10 added together is 6/10. My last step is check, can you simplify? So in order to check that, I need to set up my answer in the slide method. 6/10. 6 and 10 are both even, so I know that I can divide both of these by 2. 6 divided by 2 is 3. 10 divided by 2 is 5. And if I look at 3 and 5, the only number I can think of that will divide both of them is 1. 3 divided by 3 is, or 3 divided by 1 is 3. 5 divided by 1 is 5. And I bring my slashes all the way down. So the simplest form equals 3/5. So when I write my final answer, 1/2 plus 1/10 equals 3/5. Now let's try a subtraction problem. Once again, I wrote my steps out to the side so I can refer to them to remind me what to do first, second, third, and fourth. With subtraction, I'm going to follow the exact same steps. The only thing you need to remember is it's very important what order a subtraction problem is written in. So I'm going to start by looking at my LCD. So I'm going to look at the two denominators, 12 and 4. So step 1, I'm going to set up my slide method for 4 and 12. And I'm going to ask myself what can go into 4 that will also go into 12. Well, they're both even, so I know I can start with 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2. 12 divided by 2 is 6. So now I'm looking at 2 and 6. They are also even numbers, so I can divide by 2 again. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 6 divided by 2 is 3. And since I see a 1, I must be done. So I'm going to make my L and multiply everything inside. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 3 is 12. So the LCD is 12. So when I look back at my problem, I'm going to see if either of the fractions I already have the denominator of 12. And 7/12 already has it. So now that I've completed step 1, I'm going to go on to step 2 and do a fraction times fraction. Now for step 2, I only need to change 1/4. Now I know my end denominator needs to be 12. So 4 times what equals 12? 4 times 3. If I do it to the bottom, I do it to the top. 1 times 3 is 3. So my equivalent fraction for 1/4 is 3/12. So that was my second step. My third step is to rewrite and solve. Now, since this is a subtraction problem, it matters what fraction comes first. So when I look back at the problem, it was 7/12, and we said 7/12 was not going to change because it already had the denominator 12. Minus, the second fraction was 1/4, and we said 1/4 is now going to be written as 3/12. So now I can subtract because my denominators are the same. 7 minus 3 is 4/12. My last step is to check and see if I can simplify my answer 4/12. So I'm going to set up the slide one last time. And I know that 4 and 12 can both be divided by 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1. 12 divided by 4 is 3. It actually works out that my simplest form and my LCD slide are the same. So my simplest form is 1/3. So my final answer is 7/12 minus 1/4 equals 1/3. Now try these problems. Write down the 4 steps to help you remember what order to solve them in. Remember that step 4, you may or may not be able to simplify your final answer, but you should at least try to make sure that it's in the simplest form.